Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we strip away the noise and get right to the essential knowledge nuggets that really matter. Today, we are zooming in on something you probably never really think about when you look in the mirror, the essential transition metals.
It really does sound like a dusty corner of the periodic table, doesn't it?
Now,
But this is biology at its absolute sharpest edge. We're talking about elements like iron, zinc, and copper. They make up, maybe 0.4 to 0.5% of your total body mass. A tiny, tiny fraction.
just a fraction.
But without them, life as we know it would just grind to a halt. They are the ultimate micronutrients, absolutely critical for everything from breathing to repairing your DNA.
So our mission today is a deep dive straight into the biochemistry of these inorganic elements. We're going to be looking at the 9 nutritionally essential ones: iron, manganese, zinc, cobalt, copper, nickel, molybdenum, vanadium, and chromium. We really need to understand why they're essential, how they function at that precise molecular level, and what happens clinically when the machinery that handles them goes wrong.
And the clinical side is just immense because the whole system operates on a razor's edge. Deficiencies can cause these severe, sometimes fatal pathologies.
Right.
Think pernicious anemia from iron deficiency or devastating neurological issues like Manx disease, which comes from copper mismanagement.
And the risk doesn't stop there. The flip side of deficiency is, of course, toxicity. When levels are too high, even these essential elements, let alone toxic heavy metals, they can become profoundly dangerous.
Yeah.
We're talking oxidative damage, maybe even carcinogenesis. It's a real tightrope walk.
It truly is a case of the dose makes the poison.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Why do we need these specific elements? What unique chemical properties allow this small group of metals to do such diverse and critical jobs that, say, abundant elements like sodium or calcium just can't?
Well, the answer, it really comes down to their dynamic chemistry. If you look at those common alkali or alkaline earth metals, sodium, potassium, calcium, they have these fixed, stable ions.
Na plus K, K plus K, K plus metal.
Right. Once they lose their valence electrons, they're done. They're good for structure or for signaling, but they don't do any of the heavy chemical lifting.
They're just holding things in place or like opening gates.
Exactly. Transition metals, on the other hand, they have this property called multivalency.
Multivalency.
Yes. Take iron, for instance. It can cycle through so many different valence states. It often cycles between +2 and +3, but sometimes it can go as high as +6. This incredible ability to undergo these dynamic transitions, to readily accept or donate electrons, makes them the perfect electron carriers. They're the ultimate chemical power switches that you need for all those oxidation reduction or redox reactions.
The ones that fuel the cell.
That's their fundamental redox power.
So multivalency is key for energy transfer. But that's only, half the story? Because they also act as acids, and not the kind that burns your skin.
No, not at all. They're potent Lewis acids. When most people hear acid, they think of a Brensted-Lowry acid, which is something that donates a proton, an H+6. Lewis acids are fundamentally different. They're aprotic. They don't have a proton to give away. Instead, they have empty valence orbitals.
So instead of being pushers, they're pullers. They pull electrons in.
Precisely. Think of a Lewis acid like, say, divalent zinc, Zn2 plus C, or manganese, Mn2 plus A, as having this empty socket that's just ready to accept a lone pair of electrons from another molecule. And this pulling power is used brilliantly in hydrolytic enzymes. The metal will grab onto an active site water molecule and use its Lewis acid strength to just aggressively pull electron density away from that oxygen atom.
Which makes the water molecule hyperreactive?
It enhances the water's nucleophilicity. It essentially weaponizes the water, making it extremely aggressive so it can drive critical catalytic reactions like breaking stubborn bonds or rapidly hydrating carbon dioxide.
Wow.
That dual combination Lewis acidity for catalysis and multivalency for electron transport, that's why they are absolutely indispensable.
That power is astonishing, but it also creates a huge vulnerability. So let's pivot to the dark side of this, toxicity.
Right. We have to talk about control. Heavy metals, and that's loosely defined as elements with a density over 5 grams per cubic centimeter, or an atomic number over 20, so think arsenic, lead, mercury.
The bad guys.
The bad guys, yeah. They're toxic because they exploit the very chemical properties we've just been admiring.
So how do they actually cause damage inside a cell? What's the mechanism?
Well, one major way is through Caucasian displacement. A toxic metal ion, let's say gallium-3 plus cell, might be so similar in size and charge to an essential ion, like iron-3 plus cell, that the body's transport systems just can't tell the difference.
So it sneaks in.
It sneaks in, and it takes the essential metals parking spot inside an enzyme, say, ribonucleotide reductase.
And then the enzyme just stops working.
It becomes catalytically inert. Because J3 plus is not multivalent, it can't cycle the electrons the enzyme needs to function. It's not just a dead battery, it's like a perfectly crafted decoy that turns the whole machine off.
That is just insidious. Okay, what about the other mechanisms?
Mechanism 2 is just straightforward enzyme inactivation. A lot of heavy metals love to react with free sulfhydryl groups, especially the ones on the amino acid cysteine.
Okay.
And by forming these adducts, they just undermine the protein's entire structure. A classic example is arsenic or mercury binding to the sulfhydryl group on lipoic acid, which is vital for the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. When that happens, that whole energy pathway is just disabled.
And then there's the damage from free radicals.
Yes, mechanism 3, inducing reactive oxygen species, or ROS. Metals can generate these dangerous free radicals that cause oxidative damage. They'll attack DNA, which is a strong precursor to cancer, and they cause peroxidation of membrane lipids, which disrupts cell membranes, especially in the brain.
What stands out here is just how urgent the treatment for acute poisoning is. You can't just wait for the body to sort it out.
No, you have to go in aggressively. Acute poisoning is treated with powerful chelating agents, which are molecules designed to bind the metal really tightly and neutralize it so it can be excreted, and you might use diuretics or even hemodialysis. You have to yank that poison out fast.
And that intense need for control is exactly why the body has this whole other system, which I guess is the second big theme here, complexation.
Exactly. You almost never see a free transition metal floating around inside your body. They're immediately sequestered or packaged into these organometallic complexes.
So the body basically gift wraps them. It uses specific functional groups on amino acids like the oxygen on aspartate or the sulfur on cysteine to package them up.
Yeah.
Or it puts them into big prosthetic groups like heme.
That's a perfect way to put it. This complexation is the body's packaging solution, and it offers 4 huge advantages. 1, protection against unwanted oxidation. 2, suppression of ROS production. 3, it enhances their solubility so they can be moved around. And 4, most critically, it controls their reactivity.
What's fascinating here is how the gift wrapping, the surrounding ligands, can actually tune the metal's properties for a super specific job.
Oh, this is a masterclass in biochemical engineering. Just consider the iron in myoglobin versus the iron in cytochrome C.
Well,
Both use a heme group, right?
Right, same basic package.
But myoglobin's ligands are designed specifically to keep iron in the Fe2 plus state, which is perfect for just holding on to oxygen.
So it locks it down for storage.
But the ligands in cytochrome C are just slightly different, and they tune the iron to cycle really rapidly between the +2 and +3 states. It becomes a highly efficient electron transport wire.
Same element, same general package, but a tiny tweak changes its job from storage to conducting electricity.
And complexation also lets you build these multi-metal units, which can do these highly complex reactions that a single ion just couldn't handle.
Okay.
Look at cytochrome oxidase, the grand finale of the electron transport chain. It needs 2 iron atoms and 2 copper atoms all working together, accumulating the 4 electrons needed to reduce O2 all the way to water. That kind of precision only happens because of how those metals are complexed and held in place.
Or something like urease, which uses 2 nickel atoms at the same time to polarize a bond and activate a water molecule, all to hydrolyze urea.
Yeah.
The metals are doing 2 different jobs at once.
Exactly.
Okay, let's get into the functional roles of the heavyweights, starting with iron. Fe. It really is the workhorse.
Iron is the most functionally versatile, for sure. As we said, it has dual roles, carrying O2 and hemoglobin and myoglobin, and then carrying electrons and cytochromes and these incredibly diverse FeS clusters. And that all relies on its ability to cycle between +2 and +3.
And that cycling is taken to an extreme in the liver. We're talking about the cytochrome P450 family.
Oh yeah, that system is amazing. It cycles iron between +2, +3, +4, and even a potent +5 oxidation state to generate this extraordinarily powerful oxidant, FeO, with a 3+ charge. This is the chemical muscle the body uses to neutralize a huge range of xenobiotics toxic compounds.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, connecting the chemistry to, new discoveries. You mentioned FeS clusters are also in enzymes for DNA replication and repair.
Yes, and while the field is still sort of exploring the exact mechanism, the proposed function is just mind-blowing.
Go on.
These FES centers may actually be acting as electrochemical detectors for damaged DNA. They could be sensing subtle shifts in the cell's charge or redox state caused by DNA damage and then act as modulators, signaling the repair machinery to stop or start.
Wait. So we're talking about a subatomic detection mechanism using tiny iron-sulfur components. That would mean our cells have this sophisticated electrically integrated repair system. The iron isn't just carrying oxygen, it's monitoring the genetic code.
It really speaks to the depth of cellular intelligence. Now, pivoting slightly, let's move to manganese. It's mostly in the mitochondria, where it tends to act as a Lewis acid in its +2 state. You see it in key enzymes like isocitrate dehydrogenase.
Then we have zinc, xanthin, the structural stabilizer. And it's unique because it dodges that whole redox risk.
Absolutely. Zn2+ is redox-inert because it has a full valence shell. Since it can't easily switch oxidation states, it minimizes the risk of generating those harmful ROS. This makes it perfect for stability.
Which brings us to the famous zinc finger motif.
Ah, yes, the zinc finger. It's a small polypeptide loop that's stabilized by the Zn2+ interacting with cysteine and histidine residues. These little structures are the tools that transcription factors use to bind to DNA and RNA with incredibly high specificity, controlling which genes get turned on or off.
So zinc is basically the key architect for gene expression.
In many ways, yes, but it still has that Lewis acid capability for catalysis. You see it in critical hydrolytic enzymes. Carbonic anhydrase, which manages CO2 in your blood, or maybe more critically in medicine, beta-lactamase 2, which bacteria use to fight off antibiotics.
How does that work?
The zinc in the active site weaponizes a water molecule to attack the antibiotic's lactam ring, destroying the drug and giving the bacteria resistance.
Okay, next up is cobalt, Co. Its role in humans is pretty much exclusive, isn't it?
That's right. The only known function of dietary cobalt in humans is as the core of vitamin B12 cobalamin. The CO3+ atom acts as a Lewis base to transfer 1 carbon groups, essential for making methionine, for example.
And copper, Co. Another key redox player, cycling between +2 and +1.
Copper is incredibly busy. It's in about 30 metalloenzymes. It's essential for cytochrome oxidase, for dopamine beta-hydroxylase, and it's also part of tyrosinase, which is the rate-limiting step in making melanin.
The pigment in your skin and eyes.
Exactly. And it contributes to detoxification, too. The enzyme Q, ZNSOD, cycles copper to detoxify the superoxide radical. And crucially, copper works with lysyl oxidase to cross-link collagen and elastin. That's what gives your tissues their tensile strength.
Okay, and finally, we need to talk about molybdenum.
Mo. Molybdenum is required for this unique cofactor called molybdopterin, where it cycles through +4, +5, and +6 states. It's essential for enzymes like xanthine oxidase and, importantly, sulfite oxidase.
And sulfite oxidase has a really profound clinical correlation.
It does. It's a key phe-mometalloenzyme that oxidizes toxic sulfite into harmless sulfate. If a person has a genetic mutation that prevents the synthesis of that molybdopterin cofactor, the resulting sulfite oxidase deficiency causes a fatal buildup of toxic sulfur compounds.
And that leads to
Devastating developmental defects and usually death in early infancy. The failure of one tiny metal system has just catastrophic consequences.
Now let's quickly touch on the 3 that are a bit of a puzzle: nickel, vanadium, and chromium. The source material says they're essential, but then that their precise function is cryptic.
This is a great example of the research frontier. We know from detailed dietary studies that these elements have to be included for normal health. But unlike iron or zinc, where we can point to a specific enzyme, the exact molecular targets for Ni, V, and C are still largely unknown.
So we know they're essential, we just haven't figured out their job description yet.
Pretty much. It highlights that even in a well-researched area, there are still these fundamental biological mysteries to solve.
Fascinating. So that brings us to our final piece. How does the body actually absorb and transport these incredibly powerful and potentially dangerous elements?
Well, the general principle is that absorption in the gut is highly inefficient, and this is likely an evolutionary adaptation. It's a buffer against toxicity. If we absorbed everything easily, we'd overdose constantly.
That makes sense. So how does it work for the major players?
For iron, manganese, and nickel, The divalent forms Fu2 plus O, Mn2 plus Ai2 plus are all absorbed by one key protein in the duodenum called the divalent metal ion transport protein, or DMT1.
Okay.
But importantly, dietary iron is often F3 plus Fa, which has to be reduced to F2 plus by another protein before DMT1 can even grab it. It's a whole gatekeeper system.
But molybdenum and vanadium get a different ride, right?
They do. They're absorbed as oxyanions, molybdate and vanadate, and they use a nonspecific anion transporter that they share with sulfate and phosphate, so they're all competing for the same ride.
And cobalt, as vitamin B12, has its own VIP express line.
A completely dedicated specialized pathway. It needs to bind to haptocorin, then intrinsic factor, and then it's taken up by the cubolin receptor. This incredibly intricate process just underscores how absolutely necessary it is.
You see competitive interactions, right? Like too much zinc can block copper absorption.
Exactly. Excess zinc can actually trigger anemia by inhibiting copper absorption, which just proves the whole system is this delicate balancing act. They're all fighting for space.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what are the key takeaways for you from this deep dive?
I think there are three critical nuggets. First, it all boils down to two indispensable chemical properties. Their multivalency for redox and electron transport, and their Lewis acidity for activating molecules for catalysis.
Okay, number two.
Second, these powerful agents can't be left free. They have to be tightly controlled in these intricate organometallic complexes, the hemes, the FES clusters, the zinc fingers, to prevent toxicity and, really crucially, to fine-tune their function.
Right, storage versus conduction.
Exactly. And third, the clinical significance is immense. It spans everything from stabilizing protein structures for DNA binding with zinc to managing critical metabolism with molybdenum, where one simple deficiency can be fatal.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Consider that proposed role of the FES clusters in DNA repair one more time. If these clusters truly function as electrochemical sensors, detecting subtle disruptions in the cellular charge from damaged DNA, it suggests that the fundamental electrical health of your cells is being monitored constantly by tiny pieces of iron. This suggests a form of molecular electrical surveillance that relies entirely on these transition metals, a deeper dive for you to consider on your own. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the essential transition metals. We'll see you next time.